Good evening. They say the way you can tell you're at a Catholic meeting is there's no one in the front pew and the audio visuals don't work, but we took care of that by filling the room. You have to sit up front. Cardinal McCarrick, there's a seat for you up front here. We don't always have two cardinals for our panel, so this is special.
So we have to be very good.
We're very grateful to have Cardinal McCarrick with us and Cardinal Turkson all the way from Rome and Archbishop Tomasi and all of you. We have been having sort of an internal discussion about Catholic social thought, the Catholic Church, Catholic higher education, and there seem to be some things going on outside of our little world. It wasn't that long ago that I was in the House of Representatives watching Pope Francis deliver an appeal for civility, to defend the poor, to deal with the globalization of indifference. My memories are not primarily of the solitary white figure up front, although that was stunning as he struggled to speak in English, and in an enormous show of respect cited Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton as models for our country. But I could not take my eyes away from Joe Biden and John Boehner, two Catholic kids from Ohio and Pennsylvania, who were old enough to remember that in 1960, major public figures, Billy Graham, Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, Donald Trump's pastor, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., said that John Kennedy should not be elected president because he would take advice from the Pope. And here we were, not that long later, and the only thing the two parties seemed to agree on was they needed advice from the Pope. But frankly, we haven't taken the advice from Pope Francis. We've had an election. Washington has never been in great shape, but it's particularly dysfunctional and chaotic today. Russia, the tweets, and while we're focused on that, big questions are facing us about whether we save the safety net, whether we care for creation, whether we provide health care for all, whether we respect religious freedom. And those divisions run through the country and they run through the religious community. So we have tonight three remarkable members of the way too small Sanity Caucus in Washington. I'm delighted to have for you this evening Michael Gerson is known to many of you as George W. Bush's speechwriter and assistant to the president. What many of you may not know is in the White House, Michael was a fierce advocate for the poor and the vulnerable and the sick. PEPFAR, which in many ways is George Bush's greatest achievement, I think, Michael was a part of that, and literally millions of people in Africa and elsewhere are alive because of that. When we were fighting to get the children's tax credit made refundable, I think the most important anti-poverty measure in the last 15 years, Michael was our quiet ally. He writes for the Washington Post, he appears on PBS, he appears on cable networks of various stripes. He is the architect of compassionate conservatism, and he's a lonely voice, frankly, right now. He wrote a book called Heroic Conservatism, and Michael is a heroic conservative, and we need him, and we need his voice today. Emma Green is first and most important Georgetown alum. There is a remarkable group of young women who cover religion and public life with incredible sensitivity and insight and knowledge, and Emma is, I think, preeminent among them. If you're not reading her in The Atlantic, you're missing something important. I just clipped a few of her stories in the last few days. The bizarre love affair of Bernie and Francis. Last night in this room was the manager of the Bernie Sanders campaign, Jeff Weaver, who asked Cardinal Turkson to bless a rosary for his son. That love affair apparently continues. Why only cafeteria Catholics can survive in American politics. We'll ask you to expand on that. Wrote a wonderful probing profile of Cardinal Supich, the cardinal trying to save Chicago. And my favorite, Pope Francis Trump Whisperer, analyzing not only the conversations but the pictures. She is an incredibly astute observer of faith and politics. She particularly helps us understand, for us old people, what's going on in younger people. Mark Shields is a proud product of Notre Dame and the United States Marine Corps. He hails from Massachusetts. He's worked in a variety of losing presidential campaigns. And a lot of other successful campaigns. You know him as the commentator on the NewsHour. What you may not know is he takes up the collection at Blessed Sacrament Parish every Sunday. If I were at Blessed Sacrament, I'd put more money in the basket of Mark Shield. But he has been a proud Democrat who has not been afraid to challenge his party at a time when it needs considerable challenge. So my first question is a general question, which is, from the time the Pope came with his appeal for civility, dialogue, and care to the poor, to this afternoon in the Rose Garden, what has happened and what role has faith played in that? And why don't we begin with you, Emma?
Well, I think it's appropriate that the major answer to that question is the election of Donald Trump. When the president, went to visit Pope Francis in Rome during his first international trip, there were some jokes going around remembering that when Speaker John Boehner had met the Pope the next day he resigned, when Bill O'Reilly was removed from Fox News that morning, he was in the receiving line at the Vatican meeting Pope Francis, and there was a question, will the Francis effect extend to the President of the United States? I do think that, particularly seated in America and looking out at the population here, the election of Donald Trump has been enormous for shifting the way that people are thinking about their political allegiances, shifts of coalitions, and I think largely a sense of malaise or sadness that I hear from so many people from across the political spectrum thinking about their politics. And when that comes to the role of faith, I think that it is important to maintain a sort of view on how that affects people's outlooks. I do think that in the United States in particular, and we can talk about this later, Catholics are in a difficult political position in the sense that there's really no party that fully represents a Catholic point of view. And in that way, I think Catholic voters are often split or willingly split among parties. But regardless, I do think anybody, no matter what their political convictions, has a lot to be concerned about and a lot to ask questions about under this new administration. So my answer is the easy answer because I got to go first, which is that the political era here, I think, is extraordinary and has a lot of questions.
So Michael, can you build off the...
Yeah, I would not underestimate how different and difficult this moment is. It is not a normal political time. We've been through a lot of normal political times. It's not often that people are called to reflect on the most basic commitments of a democracy. And we have been called to consider those things, who we include as members of the community, who we value and who we dehumanize. And that is a very fundamental choice. There is at one point in our history, it was all men are created equal, all people are created equal. And we've been invited to partake of a new approach, a different philosophy that the strong matter more than the weak, and the winners are superior to the losers, and human dignity stops at certain borders and certain groups and certain religions. And that is, a profound set of issues. It has taken a very real expression in the budget when you look at it, where almost all the cutting is done at the expense of the poor and the vulnerable and the elderly, and really represents a fundamentally different approach to what governing means. It's true with legal services and college access and food stamps and Medicaid and community service block grants. And in the area that I'm concerned about, it envisions a 30% cut in development and diplomacy spending, 25% cut in global health spending. By very good estimates, just the cuts in HIV spending could cost up to 1 million lives. And so I'm not a Catholic, but I think in many ways it's the Catholic moment. I think that the country really needs the powerful personalism that the Pope presents. It really needs solidarity as the basis of our politics. And right now, that's not the case, and the argument is fully engaged.
Michael was a part of one of our earlier panels on the Francis factor, and my recollection is one of the most vivid memories I had. You said, I'm not a Catholic, but you have a pope who's a troublemaker, and there's nothing more dangerous than a troublemaker with a plan. Mark, you are a Catholic, an usher, I should point out.
There's no second collection tonight.
Yeah. How much time do you get off purgatory for being an usher?
Well, that's the Cardinal.
What's your take of what happened to us?
Well, I think, let me just try and answer it in two ways. What happened to us, and I came to Washington in 1964 and went to work on Capitol Hill. And the first major piece of legislation for Senator William Proxmire of Wisconsin was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it was an enormously difficult task. We passed the Public Civil Rights Act of 1964, which opened up public accommodations, restaurants, airlines, hotels, and so forth. But voting rights was giving power to people who had it. And it was a real and genuine filibuster by Democratic senators from the Old South. And by I say a filibuster, it was around the clock, and it went for 80 days. And every day, the leaders of the civil rights movement in the Senate would meet. Everett Turkson, the Republican leader from Illinois, and Mike Mansfield, one of my political heroes, Democratic leader from Montana, Jacob Javits, the Republican of New York, and Phil Hart of Michigan, the closest thing to a civic saint I've known in my 50 years in Washington, 55 years. And they would meet every day, and it was Turkson was a marvelously Shakespearean figure with great command of the language. He was a ham. And Mansfield was a very reticent Westerner. He once went on Face the Nation, and they ran out of questions after 23 minutes. He would say yes, nope, can't say. And but Turkson would go on about humankind and brotherhood and so forth. Well, and this was covered literally hourly by the television networks. I mean, Roger Mudd, who's a good friend of mine, became a wealthy man because at the time, CBS paid people $125 every time they appeared on the air. He appeared on 6 times a day for 80 days. And Roger put his kids through college and bought a nice home in Virginia. And so, but every day they meet, and after a couple of weeks, the staff leader of the Midwestern Democratic senator came to see Mansfield's top person. He said, look, he said, every day we meet in Turkson's office, and and Turkson dominates this. I mean, this is a Democratic bill sponsored by a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, at considerable cost to himself, couldn't we at least meet a couple of days a week in Senator Mansfield's office? And Mike Mansfield, who was just a marvelous man, the only senator in our history who served in all three branches of the United States military by the age of 20. He had enlisted in the Navy at the age of 14 with a faked baptismal certificate. And he just turned to his own staff guy who suggested this as a messenger, and he said, let's get one thing straight. The Republican Party suffered a terrible defeat in 1964, Barry Goldwater, on civil rights. And he said, anything that helps people see that the Republican Party is returning to the legacy of Abraham Lincoln is good for the Republican Party, and it's good for the United States of America. Now, I frankly can't imagine anybody in a position of leadership saying that today. I mean, I personally like Nancy Pelosi a lot, and puts me in a distinct minority, but I like her very much. And I don't dislike Paul Ryan or Chuck Schumer or Mitch McConnell. The jury's out. But I just cannot imagine them saying that. And that's really how we have changed. But one of the reasons we were able to do it in the 60s is the gross domestic product of the country was doubling in that decade. Now, what does that mean? That means that there's a pie that's expanding. So if we're going to give other people a chance and let them in and give them a right, it's not going to be at a cost to my children or my grandchildren. And I just take you this, between 1997 and 2015 in this country, the gross domestic product of the United States of America doubled. It went from 8.6 trillion to 17.1 trillion. The number of billionaires went from 64 to 565. 64 to 565, and yet the median household income was less in 2015 than it was in 1997. And when that happens, you become self-concerned. You become less generous, less empathetic. And that's what Donald Trump tapped into. Make no mistake about it. It was there. It was there to be exploited. It's a tragedy that he exploited it. But there were 31 counties in Iowa that voted for Barack Obama out of the 94 that voted for Donald Trump in 2016. There were 22 counties in Wisconsin that had voted for Barack Obama and then voted for Donald Trump. There were 14 counties in Michigan that voted for Donald Trump after voting for Barack Obama. So the easy excuse that this is all about race, this is a racist thing. These people had already voted for an African American for president in overwhelmingly white areas. So put that aside. I mean, this was an election about fear in the worst sense. It was fear of change and fear of what was going on in the country, fear of social change and cultural change, but fear that my own children would not have a future, that our own old downtown was gone, that the factories were gone, the jobs were gone. And Donald Trump promised to bring back an America that many of us in the rearview mirror saw as far brighter and more prosperous. Hillary Clinton's campaign was about fear of Donald Trump. So you had an election for the first time in our lifetime where both of the candidates were unfavorable. On election day, Donald Trump was 38 favorable and 60 unfavorable to people who voted. Hillary Clinton was 43 favorable and 55 unfavorable. So you had two candidates who were unelectable. If either had been running unopposed, they would have lost. They had, in order for one of them to win, they had to be running against the other. And so that's really the sourness and the lack. I mean, America is built on optimism. I mean, we are an immigrant people. It is deep in our DNA. With the exception of those who were here when Columbus arrived, or those who were brought here against their will in chains, every American is either himself or herself an immigrant or the direct lineal descendants of immigrants. And much has been written and rhapsodized about the immigrant experience and the courage required. It's enormous to leave friends and family and familiar surroundings, to strike out across the sea or the continent or a place you've never been, to live among people you've never met, to speak a language in many cases you've never heard. But it's also a statement of profound optimism, a belief that somewhere I can breathe free and make things better, if not immediately myself, than those who come after me. You take optimism out of the United States of America character, and we're little more than continental Belgium. I mean, no disrespect to anybody in the room from Brussels, but there aren't people all over the planet tonight praying, scheming, dreaming, planning, and saving to get to Belgium. And that has been the United States. And that has been us at our best. And we are not at our best now. And it is, agreeing with Emma and with Michael, it is frankly a dismal time, and a time for the commitment of everybody in this room and everybody we all know, because it's going to be a long storm.
Michael, it's a dismal time, according to Mark. It's a tough time to be a committed, compassionate conservative and Republican. What is your take on what happened to your party?
Well, I would fundamentally agree with Mark. I remember going to the 2012 Republican convention, sitting on the floor, listening to speaker after speaker, which is a trial, but it was useful and interesting. There was not a single word directed towards a wage earner in the floor of the Republican convention. You would assume from the discourse, from the rhetoric, that everyone in America was an entrepreneur. And so there was a huge gap in the way that Republicans approach these issues that created the context that allowed Donald Trump to run against the Republican Party and win its nomination. It was a hostile takeover, not a logical consequence, in my view. I worked for Jack Kemp. I worked for Dan Coates. I worked for George W. Bush. They had you may disagree with their policies, but they were not ethno-nationalists.
No.
And there's a fundamental difference there. What we've really seen, and it's remarkable but not unprecedented, is the return of nativism to the center of American politics and American life. And that is, it has happened before. It's happened against Catholics, it's happened against Asians, it's happened against a lot of different people. And now we're talking about migrants, refugees, Muslims as the enemies in the American story, and as infiltrators and invaders. And that's a terrible thing in and of itself. It's also a terrible thing because of the opportunity cost of bigotry, which is you don't confront the real problems. If you're blaming migrants for our economic circumstance, rather than talking about how people need to be educated for the jobs that are necessary in a new economy, you are actually undermining effective policy. And right now, the policy debate on the Republican side is almost completely sterile. And that's because they have blamed the wrong things and people instead of confronting the genuine problems that are faced in our time. I was with a mutual friend the other night where they were saying happily that I had somehow become a liberal. And the reality is that I don't think I've changed. I think the debate has changed. There used to be two contending visions of the common good, different ways of getting there, one more market-oriented, one more state-oriented, genuine arguments between the two, but they were two visions of the common good. And now we're having an argument about whether there is a common good to serve at all. And that has, I think, united people across parties in interesting ways. But it has, it has undermined the Republican appeal. We're going to get to millennials in a while. But I have a son who made their first vote in this last presidential election. And it is going to be a tough sales job to ever get him to vote Republican because he identifies the party with bias. And that, I think, it's been profoundly damaging in the long term for Republican prospects. I'm not hopeless, But I think that it's, this hostile takeover succeeded. And we're seeing the results.
Mark, you may want to add your analysis of the hostile takeover of the Republican Party, but the Democrats couldn't take advantage. I mean, if you can't beat Donald Trump, who can you beat? What's going on among progressive and Democrats that left them literally with no place in Washington where they hold the majority or power?
No, I mean, the 8 years of Barack Obama were historic, obviously, in many respects. They were disastrous for the Democratic Party. There were 256 Democrats in the House of Representatives the day he was elected, the day he took office, rather. There are 193 today. There were 40 Republican United States senators in 2009. Today, there are 52. That's a majority. There's a majority of both houses. There is not a single Democrat who chairs any committee or subcommittee on Capitol Hill. They lost 947 state legislative seats across the country in those 8 years. It was a top-down party. I mean, if you want to get to a state that has a Democratic state legislature, both houses, and a Democratic governor, you can go to 5 places out of the 50. You can get in Providence, Rhode Island, and drive to Hartford, Connecticut. And from Hartford, Connecticut, you can drive all the way to, make your choice, Salem, Oregon, or Sacramento, California. And then you get a boat or a plane to Honolulu, Hawaii. That's it. There are 24 states where Republicans control both houses of the legislature and the governor. You can complain about redistricting and reapportionment, and the Republicans have done this and rigged it unfairly. That's fine. I mean, but the reality is the Democrats have no farm system. They have not reached out to encourage people to become part of a majority party. Ronald Reagan, whom I quote without ever having voted for or supported, said to Haley Barbour, who was his political assistant at the time. Remember Haley Barbour became Republican national chairman and governor of Mississippi. And fond of saying about him, he's a friend, that if he was thinking about running for president, I told him, Haley, if you run, you'll be the first non-English speaking candidate to run for president. But Ronald Reagan told Haley Barbour, if somebody is with us 80% of the time, they're our 80% ally and friend. They're not our 20% enemy. And that's how you build. That's what a political party is. It's a coalition. The Democratic Party is at risk right now of applying, in a minority status, of becoming a social club, of applying a litmus test. I mean, we sit here tonight when 51% of Americans think that 51% of Catholics believe that abortion is morally unacceptable. All right? We have 40% of women in the country believe that abortion is morally unacceptable. This is Pew Research. This is not something I made up out of our Sunday Visitor polling. And this is real. I mean, and so you're going to put together a majority in the country, okay? And you're going to say, when you've got a third of Democrats who are pro-life, and accept the reality. I mean, the Democrats are, whether you like it or not, a pro-choice party. They are. But I mean, that if you're going to build a coalition, I mean, there's going to be room for and voices for and attention paid to people like Bob Casey and people like Joe Donnelly and people. That's the only way you're ever going to be a majority party. There wouldn't have been an Affordable Care Act without the votes of 15 pro-life Democrats who paid for it with their seats. They lost their political careers to provide affordable care to the country. I mean, you don't see a lot of political courage like that in Washington most times. They knew they were steering into their political graves, and they did because they wanted health care for more. And we're talking here today about taking 24 million or 23 million people off of health care. I mean, that can be a moral question. I mean, we have a pope who says, I'm a sinner. We have a president who says, I'm a winner. we have an apologetic pope who apologizes for the failures and transgressions of the church. We have a vain, unapologetic president who's about as deep as a birdbath, who is criminally uncurious. I mean, the great thing about running for president is, on any subject, you can get the world's experts to come and talk to you on it. If you want to talk about why the Finnish preschool system is the best in the Western world, there's 3 PhDs who want to come in, pour out their life's work to you. Trump he couldn't tell you, for God's sakes, how a bill becomes a law. And this is what correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but this is what we're dealing with.
I have not asked Trump if he knows how a bill becomes a law.
Okay, you're right, okay, sorry, okay, end of time. But it just, one is America first, the other is global solidarity, the Pope. At every possible, it's reaching out, looking at the world from the bottom up, as opposed from the top down, and I'm a winner, and Mar-a-Lago, and that's what we have is winners there. And you want to come to this country, $500,000 to get you an investment in Kushner real estate, and you'll become a citizen. Hell of a deal. That's what we're talking about, as opposed to give me you're tired, give me you're weary, give me you're lost. And this is what America is. So it's just in stark and dramatic and kind of terrifying contrast. And it's times, the consolation of your faith and your family and friends and your beliefs that keep you going right now, because it is a time for testing for all of us.
Emma, you watch politics, you watch religion, you watch young people. Young people don't seem particularly thrilled by either of these versions of public commitment. What happened? What do you see happening now? These are folks, the vast majority of whom work with young people in Catholic colleges and universities. You study this stuff very carefully. In light of the takeover, in light of the abandonment that's been described here, what do you think happened, and where do you think things are now for young people?
One of the phrases that I hear most often talking with young people in the context of faith, but more broadly just in the context of their identities, is the term political homelessness, the feeling of young evangelicals who care very much about care for refugees and the poor, but also are strongly pro-life. People who, for example, are Muslim and feel that perhaps the way that they live is traditional and might be of a piece with conservative thinking, except that they don't feel that there's any room for them in the Republican Party. People who repeatedly in polls do not identify as one party or the other and only identify as leaning one way or the other when they're pressed. This sense that the two-party system that we have in the United States is not representative of many people, and I think the youngest generation in particular. I think there is a lot to be said for the fact that this generation, millennials, and to a certain extent Generation X, and those who come below them as well, will be forged during the Trump administration. And in certain ways, this scrambles our ability to look ahead and understand exactly what will be their legacy as they're coming more and more into adulthood. I was speaking with someone recently who is Muslim, who was talking about his coming of age and political consciousness, how he was in college in New York on 9/11, and how that moment forever shaped his life. He became a professional Muslim, and he sort of wedded his identity to his religious understanding. And one thing he was saying is that he's been mourning over the past few months the fact that there will be a generation who comes of age under Trump. And this may be for some of them something that they like. There are some people, I'm sure, who don't have any problem with that. But I do think that because this is an extraordinary political time, those people's political consciousness will be fundamentally shaped by what happens during the next 4 or 8 years. And I don't know that we have a good roadmap yet for what that will look like for the two-party system. I do think, just to follow up on something that Mike was saying about the lack of Republican leadership, or perhaps the hard sell for Republican Party for the next generation or for those who are coming after. There are things that I've been watching that are little spurts that I'm interested in. I do think there's a generation of leaders who are coming of age below the current power holders who are scrambling expectations to a certain extent on both sides. And I'm very interested to see what this will look like. For example, one thing that came to mind as you were speaking was Evan McMullin, who on the one hand had a totally hopeless presidential run, but on the other hand has out of that come to represent a certain vision of what an accepting and welcoming Republican Party looks like, and I think there are others who have that sort of note. The consequence of that under Trump is that weird bedfellows arise. I actually heard an interview with Evan McMullin on the Slate Political Gabfest, and they were loving him, and I thought that was a sign of the times that this relatively conservative Mormon Republican was beloved by the audience of the pretty hard left Slate Political Gabfest. But in itself, that's a certain kind of hopefulness because it suggests that, especially generationally, there are coalitions that we may not have been able to imagine previously that may be emerging, and there may be languages that come out of this era or in response to this era that those new generations of leaders will embrace that will hopefully get out of the two-party miasma that we've been in.
Mark talked about the contrast between the vision of Pope Francis and President Trump. You talked about the lack of appeal and the homelessness of evangelicals. Mike said this is a Catholic moment. These are folks who share a particular vision that is Pope Francis' vision, a set of principles that might underpin a Catholic moment that might appeal to young people. What do you think are the opportunities? That's for Emma, and then I'll follow up with Mike and Mark. What are the opportunities? What are the responsibilities? What are the dangers for religious leaders, especially Catholics, for Catholic universities, for people who teach and try to share Catholic social teaching in this moment?
So one thing that comes to mind immediately, the March for Life this year, it's always interesting to see what dynamics are happening, but the thing I noticed this year was a sense of real optimism and triumph. This was still in the very early days of the Trump administration. But there was a little bit of a divide. You would walk around and see signs that groups, hordes of young people, the March for Life is always populated by hordes of young people, but you would see signs that said Black Lives Matter, Refugee Lives Matter, Syrian Lives Matter, and then Unborn Lives Matter. This to me is remarkable because it suggests a scrambling around the coalitions of what Catholic young people are caring about and a real commitment to this idea of sort of a seamless garment, a church that really does care for the entire package of life. And I've met these remarkable young people. I met this wonderful young woman on the eve of the March for Life who had pink hair at Catholic University, who spoke so passionately about how much she cared in equal turn about care for refugees and the poor and also care for the unborn. The danger, to answer your question, I think for leadership, not necessarily in the university setting, but more in the political field, is to continue in the kind of bifurcated language of the culture war that I think has so characterized American politics. I do think that although this does not characterize by any means all of American millennials or the generation below them, I think there's a hunger for some of that more coherent thinking that is very much socially oriented, is about generosity of spirit, that is about reaching out to people on the margins, but also that is sort of repelled by this idea that anyone who is pro-life has to be against refugees and this weird bifurcation that we've developed in the Trump era, but that also existed previously. So I guess that to me is one of the dangers, is I don't see when I look at young Catholics a sense of natural gravitation towards culture war frames. And I think those are very easy to come back to, especially in a time when there's a lot of political anger and a sense of political division across the aisles.
Michael, you're a graduate from Wheaton. You're an evangelical. You know more about Catholic social teaching than most Catholics. What are the lessons from the evangelical experience that Catholics ought to learn? You said it was a Catholic moment. What is our opportunity? What is our danger?
Well, you had a situation this last election where 60% of white Catholics voted for Donald Trump. but the number for evangelicals, white evangelicals, was close to 80%. And that is a higher figure than George W. Bush, which is just shocking, depressing. I've really struggled with this, and because it's not just in the election where you had this terrible choice, but they have remained the backbone of Donald Trump's support in the country, have really prevented his base from imploding with 75% job approval among white evangelicals, according to Pew. 2/3 of them, or close to 3/4, believe it strongly. There are a lot of reasons for this that are unique to evangelicalism. I mean, this was a movement that in the 19th century was engaged in abolition and women's rights and a lot of other causes. Wheaton College, which I went to, was a college that educated minorities and women from its very beginning in the 1850s. But Donald Trump really tapped into this sense of being outsiders, this sense of resentment that came out of the fundamentalist modernist controversy with evangelicals, and where they went into a kind of cultural exile, and developed a movement that was fundamentally defensive. So attacks came on religious education, attacks came on school prayer, attacks came on religious liberty. And their agenda has been largely determined by the perceived aggressions of modernity. And so, when I talk to evangelical audiences, I use the Catholic example as the antidote to that. Catholic social thought begins with first principles and applies them. Doesn't begin with social controversies and then react to them. That, I think, the evangelicals have been fundamentally reactive. I think people need to understand maybe three things about evangelicals in this period. One, they don't really have the equivalent of social doctrine like Catholic social doctrine. What I would call an if-then doctrine, which is if you're pro-life, then you have to be pro-migrant, and the other way around, by the way. Evangelicalism doesn't have that kind of set of teachings, an if-then kind of set of teachings, and so it's really shaped itself to whatever political movement it's supporting at the time, and whether that's Reagan or Donald Trump. I think that's one reality. Second, there's very little racial and ethnic diversity that would cause a difference of perspective. In American Catholicism, I think is more than 1/3 of American Catholics are Hispanic. That has brought a richness to the reflection of the church on a set of issues that can only happen when you have people who share that experience. A lot of evangelical churches in big cities are now finding this with a much more diverse audience. But for the most part, this is not a diverse group that's not learning from others. And then strangely, without going into all the details, Donald Trump tapped into a kind of secular version of evangelical eschatology. The idea that the country is on the verge of ruin, that the only way to save us is by the return to values and practices from a previous time. The kind of fundamentalist message that he took and secularized, but was very powerful in the evangelical community. And so it is a tradition. It's a great tradition. I mean, which I've really, benefited from the example of William Wilberforce or Lord Shaftesbury or, the people that supported Abraham Lincoln through his elections. But this is a distressing time where I think that a large portion of that movement has been deceived. And what it has done, which is even worse than anything we've been talking about with the parties themselves, but has associated evangelical belief with bias, with bigotry. bigotry and bias. And that is a betrayal at a much more fundamental level. It's not justified, it's not in the long term effective, and it's wrong. So,
What should people who teach and promote and try to share Catholic social teaching learn from that lesson in terms of taking this vision and moving it forward? As you point out, 60% of white Catholics voted for something that didn't reflect that. What are the lessons from the evangelical experience for Catholic leaders like those in this room?
well, I think, I look at, I watched that speech from the Pope as well, the State of the Soul address that he gave. And there were so many lessons there about putting the needs of the vulnerable and poor at the center of our debate, about the nobility of politics when practiced correctly, about the, he mentioned the importance of wealth creation, but mostly it was a reflection of this kind of profound personalism, this idea that people matter more than ethics, people matter more than religion, people matter more than any cause because they're the cause. And that's the centerpiece teaching, not just of Catholicism, but of Christianity, in my view. So I look at institutions of higher learning, and the most fundamental value that has to be incorporated if we're going to have a just and humane politics is empathy. We have a tremendous gap or deficit of empathy in America. And that is imagining yourself in other circumstances in someone else's shoes. So I think that's the basic lesson. For whatever reason, evangelicals have been conditioned in their political views more by Fox News than by evangelical social teaching, and has really allowed a foreign set of values to determine the shape of its social engagement. So that, I think, is the real enemy. There's so many people. When you look at the polling as it relates to immigration, for example, one of the things that just disturbs me is that people react like their socioeconomic cohort, not by their faith. That's not the primary determinant. You would think that that would be what determines your views on these questions, when in fact it's the group of people you identify with and the background, whose background you share. It's like, if Christians are not bringing anything distinctive to that argument, there is a fundamental failure of teaching. And I think that's part of what we face.
I'm going to invite questions, but before that, I want to turn to Mark. Michael's extraordinarily candid in assessing the failures and challenges and dangers that afflict the evangelical community. How would you assess the opportunities, responsibilities, and dangers in our Catholic community, especially in light of Pope Francis' vision and Catholic social teaching?
If I could just pick up on one thing Michael said. Michael worked for Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp and Ronald Reagan, between them, changed conservatism in this country. Conservatism was a 5 minutes to midnight look. Things were bad, they're getting worse, but they're going to get darker. And Kemp and Reagan changed it to a 5 minutes to sunrise. That we could do it, that we could work together, that we're larger than this, and there's no question that Trump represents that 5 minutes to midnight. That how bad and dismal, and we're all surrounded in this by these foreign and hostile forces in our own country, in our own neighborhood, in our own community. I would just say to those who are involved politically, engage. I mean, the original sin of the United States was slavery. The only reason that this country overcame its original sin was the dedication, the commitment, the selfless involvement of evangelical Anglicans, of Quakers, and Methodists. You know, there's an iron rule of religion and politics. No priest, no minister, no rabbi, no imam should be involved in any political issue unless that priest, rabbi, imam, or minister agrees on my side. In that case, he should be fully engaged. But I really do think that it's important to remind ourselves that the civil rights movement in this country enlisted priests and rabbis and nuns and ministers, but it was led by the Reverend Martin Luther King, the Reverend Andrew Young. I mean, that's important. It was a Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I mean, that's when Christianity and Christian principles and Christian values really did change the nation and change it for the better. I think it's the same was true in the anti-war. And I do, at the risk, Mike Curtin's here, one of the great people in Washington, and I'm going to risk our friendship by telling something that I told him earlier, to say nothing of John Ensler, and that is that this administration is populated by a Secretary of the Treasury who was from Goldman Sachs. Chief Economic Advisor in the White House, Gary Cohn, is from Goldman Sachs. Secretary of the Security and Exchange Commission chairman is from Goldman Sachs. There are so many people from Goldman Sachs in the Trump administration that there's nobody left at Goldman Sachs to listen to Hillary Clinton's speeches. So I just did want to make that point. But I mean, I do think that we, if there's anything that Francis's message means to me, it is, I mean, that it is our responsibility. I mean, we just can't withdraw into the comfort and protection of our own. I mean, that everybody, we are the only face of Christ that these people may see in a week. The suffering and the marginalized and the scorned and the despised. I mean, it begins personally, but it's a commitment publicly as well. I mean, I really think that has to be. I mean, the idea that 60% of Catholics voted for Donald Trump is sobering. 60% of white Catholics, it's sobering. I mean, it's hard to reconcile whatever he said with Catholic social teaching. Whether it's the least of these or brothers and sisters or generosity of spirit or community or refugees. I mean, it just isn't. I mean, and we have a pope who's the most popular figure in the world, and we have the least popular American president in history. That ought to tell us something. That ought to be a source of some encouragement, I would hope. So that's my encouraging line.
Questions, quickly. Let's start way in back.
Yeah, so thank you for the...
Need-
Thanks. So thank you so much for this. I, just briefly, I was born and raised in New York on Long Island. I was educated in Boston and Washington, D.C. Until I was 32, but I've lived for 25 years in Nebraska. And I'm wondering, I haven't heard much about the rural-urban. And, here, we talk about flyover country, and this just enrages me. It's as if this part of the world doesn't exist, as this part of the United States is totally an afterthought. And all around us are these rural communities suffering from meth addiction and, enormous decline. And I'm just wondering what your comment would be on how the rural-urban is figuring into this.
Who wants to take a stab at that?
Emma does.
Emma?
Sure. Well, so I'm from Tennessee, and I was born in Kentucky, so I'm squarely from flyover country and have a lot of empathy for that point of view, a sort of frustration at the attitudes, particularly when we're talking about public conversations about what animates America. I think what you've pointed to is shown again and again in the data. So this sort of blue city, red state phenomenon, where there are really big divides between the people who are in urban centers and the people who are either one layer out or more dispersed among a state. I think this is interesting when you're thinking about the formation of political communities in these states, because on the one hand, I think it points to the fact that there's more diversity than maybe we give credit for. I read a great piece, it was on actually PBS NewsHour, I think, or 60 Minutes, about Buchanan, West Virginia, and there was a group of women there who were starting to protest Donald Trump, and it's in this extraordinarily red town in West Virginia. And I think that just points to the fact that there's more diversity than we maybe give credit for. But going back to the formation of political communities, this is something that I think about a lot in my writing and my reporting, which is what are the factors of that fabric that help people hang together, feel like they're in fellowship together, have empathy for people who are unlike them, feel like they're sort of part of a whole rather than just fractured individuals. And I think this bifurcation that we have that is urban-rural is a challenging factor in that, not only in those people's life circumstances are different, their problems are different, dealing with drug addiction, different kinds of economic burdens, but moreover that their sense of fellowship being in political community is challenged, and these sort of sense of worldviews or strangeness I think is even more challenged. So I guess that doesn't have an answer for you. I try not to solve the great problems of America because I don't think I'm wise enough, but I think it's a really important divide to pay attention to.
Another hand, Cardinal McCarrick.
If you were running again, if the election were held today, would Trump win? If you were running against Hillary Clinton, I mean, he's the only sore winner I've ever seen. And she is maybe the most unattractive loser I've ever seen. So, I mean, I never heard John Kerry bitch and gripe. I never heard Al Gore bitch and gripe. I mean, they conceded, they lost. I mean, she's still talking about, I don't know, I mean, is she going to carry that forever? So, I think if the election were held today, God, I have no idea what would happen, Your Eminence. I really don't. I don't.
You're not allowed not to have an opinion.
Rare humility, rare humility. No, I mean, here's what's going to happen in 2018. What's going to happen is there's a little piece of political rule. When a president's job rating is below 50% approval, the president's party in the midterm elections loses an average of 36 House seats. When it's above 50%, the party loses an average of 14 House seats. A midterm election is a referendum only on the president and how you feel about him. And the people who turn out are basically the people who don't like what's going on. It's what happened to Obama in 2010, 2014. It's what happened to George W. Bush in 2006. The only time, 3 times in 150 years, has a party in power won seats in a midterm election. 2002, on the eve of the Iraq War vote, that George W. Bush's party, I think, picked up 6. In 1998, Bill Clinton, having been the Republicans having Newt Gingrich leading the moral crusade, the man who asked Bob Dole, why do people take such an instant dislike to me? And Bob Dole said, because it saves them time, Newt. And they picked up, and the Democrats actually picked up seats. And the other time was Franklin Roosevelt in 1934. Other than that, 150 years, the party in power loses seats. So Republicans, Donald Trump's going to be at 40, 35, I don't know where he's going to be, percent approval. So the Democrats, who stand for nothing other than the national anthem, as far as I can see, are going to win by just being the other guys. What their mission is, but I mean, that it'll be deceptive, it's delusional, because Republicans won in 2010, we're sure they're going to win in 2012, and they picked up all these House seats, 63 of them, they're going to beat Obama. They lost in 2012. Same thing happens in 2014. Republicans have a big surge in the midterm elections in 2010, and in 2014, They lose with Obama 2010, and then Obama wins re-election in 2012. So I mean, it's quite frankly, I don't know. Republicans are going to get nervous because Trump is going to be a liability. He's toxic, and people are going to move away from him. They're going to try and get daylight, and then you run the risk of a primary challenge if you're a Republican member. So it's a very sort of difficult dance. Wouldn't you agree, Michael?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. The one reason in the back of my mind I think that he might win again under the hypothetical is because he didn't hide anything that he was eventually going to do. He campaigned exactly the way that he's governing. He praised Russia during the campaign. He was opposed to the climate treaty. He said all of these things.
Yeah.
It's not as though that he had some hidden agenda that he's brought and revealed in some dramatic and appalling way. He really campaigned in such a fashion that no one had an excuse when they voted for him. It was not like Richard Nixon, who was hiding the dark side, what you see on the tapes. The dark side was at the rallies.
Yeah, it was.
And that to me is, it shows that how kind of durable his support was in a certain way.
Can I push back just a bit on this? I agree with all that, and I'm reluctant to disagree with anybody on this panel, but I don't think he was clear that he was going after the poor. Medicaid, he said he was going to save.
He wouldn't touch it. He wouldn't touch it.
As far as the budget,
Insurance,
food
health care for
stamps.
everybody. Health care for everybody was the other thing.
So it seems to me, while the country's focused on Russia and he's focused on what he's focused on, the Heritage Foundation is writing the budget, and that's the one disconnect. And I don't think lots of people care about that. Other questions? How about Dan? Here it comes.
Thank you. I think, as Emma said, a lot of us in this room feel like neither party speaks for what we stand for. But I wanted to challenge Mark a bit. I thought you were a bit kind or maybe tactful in a Catholic audience because you identified the effect on the Democrats after the Health Care Act passed, that they lost in the next time around. But you didn't mention something that I think is really important for us Catholics to admit, and that is the role that our bishops played in that process. And I want to be respectful to every bishop, but the leadership of the conference at that time was willing to accept the Affordable Care Act if the Hyde Amendment were included. And that includes several thousand abortions per year. But they were not willing to accept the existing bill because they felt it was going to include many more. Now, they described it as simply, we're against abortion, but they clearly were willing to accept the Hyde Amendment as we have as a church for a long time. So I wonder whether their opposition to those Democrats who eventually supported this bill when the bishops thought they weren't, was part of the demise of these Democrats in the end.
Well, I mean, this is one, I'm happy to try and answer it, but John was intimately involved. I covered it, and I was impressed by Pelosi's leadership more than anything else. I mean, it wasn't Barack Obama's health care bill. It was Nancy Pelosi's. I mean, I love Tip O'Neill. I mean, I did. He was a close friend and a mentor and very kind. And I admired Tom Foley, and I admired Sam Rayburn. Nobody ever has passed health care. And she passed it 3 times in the House of Representatives. And she had a revolt on her hands from the Women's Caucus, from the feminine pro-choice caucus. And she walked into them and she said, this is not an abortion rights bill. This is a health care bill. I'm voting for it, and you're going to vote for it. This was with this Stupak amendment. And she got it past the House 3 different times. And I'll be honest with you, I was more impressed by the staff work of the Bishops' Conference than I was by the bishops on health care. Once you've accepted the Hyde Amendment, and I happen to like Henry Hyde very much. I mean, but once you accept it, other than rape, incest, and life of the mother, I mean, you've agreed, you've accepted. I mean, the church, overwhelmingly, Catholics supported that position. Am I wrong, John? And so, that was included in the package to get it by. So, I'm not sure that anybody. I think the Affordable Care Act was flawed, like all human products. But I think on the whole, it helped a lot of people. I mean, we have a lot more people who have health coverage today. I think it's been an alloyed, not an unalloyed, but an alloyed blessing for our society. And I don't want to go back, and I support the people who supported it. But John can address that.
Just a footnote, I'm the moderator, not the panelist.
No, but go ahead.
The bishop's condition for supporting the bill was the status quo, the Hyde Amendment.
Yep.
The House bill included the Hyde Amendment, took a long time to persuade Nancy Pelosi, needed those votes. My profile in courage was Bart Stupak. The problem was that Ted Kennedy's seat was taken by the Republicans. So it could never come back to the Senate. And the Senate would not accept the Hyde Amendment provisions in the health care bill. There were other concerns. The treatment of immigrants was worse than the status quo. And frankly, the concerns about religious freedom were well-founded. But it was a remarkable achievement, flawed achievement. There's a lesson here that we've learned then and we learn now that passing something strictly on a partisan basis is a bad way to do public policy. And we're in Washington where you can't do anything on a bipartisan basis. If you cooperate, if you reach out to the other side, you're in trouble with your side. And I think Mark talked about that at the beginning. But other questions? Okay, way in back, and then one more, and then we'll wrap up.
Just a question about the.
You're going to correct the Our Sunday Visitor crack?
I'm no
This is
longer
a
with
former
them, but
editor.
yeah, I would, but yeah, I'm now with Catholic News Service.
Tell them who you are, Greg.
Greg Erlandson, and I'm the director and editor-in-chief of Catholic News Service, former
And you
president
used
of
to
our
be.
Sunday Visitors. So, I went. Dave Gibson shot me a blow in the ribs on that one, but I'm interested in this idea of the dissatisfaction with both parties, and one of the things that I'd like to hear comments on is about the impact of kind of the philosophy of libertarianism, both in a sort of a social as well as an economic sense, which I think infects, if I can use that word, both parties. And I'm particularly interested, and maybe Emma has some thoughts on this, on the attraction that it has for young people. I notice with my own kids and their friends that there seems to be that pull, and we see it manifest in lots of different ways, like the drug laws and all that. But I'm just curious that there's an erosion beyond Trump, beyond Hillary, and all this, that this attraction to libertarianism has impact on the empathy gulf that Michael talks about, on the sense of human dignity, and the common good. So just interested in your thoughts.
Well, I think in terms of the generational outlook, it's important to remember that the most popular candidate among young people during this election cycle was an atheist Jew who was the closest thing politics has seen to a Catholic Democrat in a really long time, a Catholic socialist in a really long time.
Yeah. Feel the burn. Feel the burn.
Yes, exactly. I think the Bernie revolution is instructive in a lot of ways for one impulse, which I don't know is totalizing, and I don't know that it is necessarily something that could explain away the libertarian impulse that you're hearing from your kids or seeing elsewhere. But I do think that there was something about the language that he was using and the frame that he was using, that becoming within the band of acceptable and popular political discourse in this election cycle, which was telling. and the fact that young people found so much enthusiasm around this idea of an expansive state that would be providing a very robust set of social services, that really jived with young people's sense of sort of social justice and social good, that is telling. I do think, though, with the libertarianism streak, one aspect of this that I see really strongly and think about again in terms of this idea of coming of age during certain eras. Millennial generation has come of age during the era of Edward Snowden and the surveillance state. I do think that civil libertarianism, this idea of suspicion of the state apparatus that are surveying populations or impeding on our rights, social media being this ever-present sort of stew that young people are in, you can't undercount that for people's political formation and consciousness. But in terms of the economic libertarianism, I actually would look more towards the left and this resurgence of the popularity and acceptability of socialism as this weird phenomena and interesting phenomena among young people.
And it could be, I would only add, I agree with that. I mean, I expected to see Rand Paul do well in this election. I would have predicted that we have that debate rather than the ones that we eventually had.
Yeah.
But we didn't, and I think the real danger here is that we no longer have a center-right party in the sense that we've seen. And the way that Democrats react to the Trump phenomenon will determine whether we have a center-left party in America. You look at the British example, they went towards democratic socialism. Jeremy Corbyn. And there are more Corbyn-like options on the Democratic side. If that's the lesson they draw from this last election, we would be have a more extreme polarization than we're even seeing now.
That's right.
If we really have no center-right or center-left party left in America.
I'd say Michael raises a very cautionary note, and I agree with it. Emma said, but here's what you have to bear in mind. There are 241 Republicans in the House of Representatives. The midterm election in 2018 is a referendum on the president and their stewardship. They will not have a health care bill. They will not have a tax cut bill, a reform bill. They will not have a tax cut bill. They will not have an infrastructure bill. They will not have a record. So, and they'll have an unpopular president. So, what you have is a temptation to the Democrats. The Republicans won back the House in 2010 and kept it in 2014 by voting 58 times to repeal Obamacare. A cheap, meaningless, empty vote. 58 times they courageously stood up and we're going to repeal Obamacare and we're going to get rid of this curse, and they have nothing to offer in its place. All right, that's the first thing. The second thing is we have to understand, Emma talked about coming of age and what the experience is. People in this room, think about this. In 1989, we had a savings and loan crisis in this country. George H.W. Bush was president. It cost the American taxpayers $124 billion with a B. We got through it. 1,100 savings and loan executives went to jail. We had a mortgage crisis, a Wall Street theft that brought the country to its knees, that destroyed people's lives, that robbed them of their homes, of their savings. It cost the country, according to the St. Louis Federal Reserve study, $13.4 trillion. $13.4 trillion. I'm still waiting for the first Gucci-clad, three-piece suit, tailor-made, to go before a judge. Not one. You go through that as a people, and in 2 wars, all respect, failed wars that have been the violation of every principle of American values. War demands equality of sacrifice. All the suffering, all the pain, all the tragedy has been borne by 0.5% of Americans, and there hasn't been a cabinet officer who's been to a funeral. We had a war, when I grew up, With the President of the United States' 4 sons, Franklin Roosevelt's 4 sons, were all in combat. Were in combat. They were fired at. They were shot at. I mean, so that is a change. As far as libertarianism is concerned, Americans, in my experience, are philosophically conservative, but we're operationally liberal. You ask Americans in the abstract, what about the federal government? Pain in the neck, red tape, get them off my back, out of my hair, out of my pocket, can't stand them. However, that same American, when told that just outside of Missoula, Montana, there was a single can of tuna fish discovered with a trace of botulism in it, have a universal American reaction. Where the hell was the federal government? I want a report in my office in 24 hours. I want heads to roll. We all want an efficient, effective, small federal government working on our side 24 hours a day, cheap. That's philosophically conservative and operationally liberal to me.
Last question. How about right here?
Thank you. Thank you so much for modeling civil public discourse. And I'm thinking about, the also in this context, the aggression toward the media. In addition to, Mark, you mentioned sort of this suspicion toward expert knowledge. One of the things that we've been discussing during our time here is what our role as academics, as faculty and leaders of academic centers in shaping public discourse and also promoting social transformation. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, the role of academics in this climate where there's suspicion of expert knowledge, and also just your own self-understanding of your role as journalists in this climate.
Well, I've been very lucky because I was asked to, and Michael as well, to be on the McNeil-Lehrer, with then McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, now the PBS NewsHour, where if insult or just cheap criticism became, you were not invited back. I mean, so there was a certain reward to at least a chance to come back if you were civil and informed and respectful. But I think that's, to me, if there's one thing in Washington I'd say to everybody who comes here, and that is that the person on the other side, maybe you might disagree with their facts, you might disagree with their conclusion, but whatever you do, respect the fact that they like the country, they're concerned about the country as much as you are. That's what's missing right now. I mean, it's not that, gee, you've got your facts wrong, it's that you don't like America, that you're obviously a moral leper, an ethical eunuch, or something worse. And so I think the respect in debate, the respect for the other person's opinion, the other person's value, the other person's integrity and intentions is critical. And that's what's missing. It's what's missing in town now. I mean, if I could do one thing as king, I would mandate that the Congress of the United States be in session from Monday morning at 10 o'clock until Friday afternoon, noon. Why do I say that? Not that they don't work hard, but just because I want them to know each other. I want them to bring their families here. I want them to live here, to know somebody across the aisle that you might carpool with, that your kids might play ball with, or you see at the movies, or you go to the same church, whatever. Nowadays, it's a lot easier to caricature somebody if you've never met them and you don't know that they're a human being. And I really think that's one of the great risks we have now. You get here Tuesday night, you have a vote on Wednesday or committee hearing, you're on the phone raising money, and then you're flying back Thursday, and you spend all the time saying how much you hate Washington, and you have to prove it by flying back home every 3 days a week. So the other thing I would say is any candidate you support, say to that candidate, I want to know why you want to be lieutenant governor or member of Congress or Senate president, whatever it is. Tell me in a paragraph without mentioning your opponent's name. Okay, that ought to be the test. What is it? Who are the villains you want to bring to the bar of justice? Who are the victims you want to aid? But do it without. I mean, there wasn't a moment in which Trump spoke that he didn't mention Hillary, or Hillary spoke and she didn't mention Trump. I mean, yes, elections are comparative, but I mean, there's got to be an affirmative action as to what you want to achieve, what you want your epitaph to be. So.
I just add to that, I was really disturbed in the Montana special election by the incident of the Republican candidate, Greg Gianforte, punching and attacking, literally lifting up by the neck and slamming to the ground a young reporter there. It was disturbing, not just because this is a bad thing to happen to a reporter, and you never want to see this happening to a reporter, but to me, it represented a norm violation that signals that the norm itself has become weaker, and this is not an isolated incident. I don't feel in danger when I'm going out and talking to people and reporting, and I'm lucky in that sense, but it is disturbing to me that we have a civic culture in the United States which, in some tacit way, or at least in some quarters, has become so hostile to the idea of press, and feels so alienated from the idea of press that has become acceptable behavior. So I would say a couple of things. I think the first is thinking about what the press has done to perhaps exacerbate that. I don't think there's anything that the press could do to justify Republican candidates for Congress body slamming a reporter to the ground, because if you're going to be in Congress, there are going to be reporters everywhere. But I do think, sort of from a media perspective, we need to be introspective. From the perspective of the young people that you all are working with, I think media literacy is really important, being able to determine what sources of news are, how they're getting their sources of information, thinking intentionally about that. I would encourage them to buy subscriptions. And I know that sounds really quaint, but this is a bad time for media, and it's going to be a bad time for my generation of people in media. We're really great right now because we're all cheap and easy to employ, but talking about young reporters having careers for generations, that it's really tough. And so getting people who are 22 to commit to buying a subscription to the New York Times or the Atlantic, I think is a good thing. And finally, I just think, along the lines of what Mark was saying, I mean, you all know the classroom experience much better than any of us could. But I do think that there's a lot of opportunity right now to model the kind of civil discourse that you were alluding to at the beginning of your question, and engaging with that around what that means, both in the media discourse and also in political engagement. What does it mean to run for office? What does it mean to go to a candidate forum and ask civil questions? What does it mean to be part of a community? Those are really important questions right now. I think that is really in jeopardy, and especially for young people who may be feeling in despair. I think those principles are really important.
I think that's a great conclusion, actually. I would only emphasize the point that the growth of partisan media has really played an important role in the polarization of our country. People are turned to the news not for information but for ammunition, and to support their pre-existing biases. And that is a serious problem. And the reality is, people used to rely on editors with balanced judgment, and now everyone is their own editor. They're getting extraordinary volume of information. And it means that young people are going to have to be taught editing skills. They're going to have to be able to determine a bad source from a good one, and they're going to have several sources of information when they approach a matter of opinion. And they're going to have to replicate many of the things that we used to have professionals do in America, that we could trust. And that, I think, is going to be a tremendous challenge, but it's also a context of a lot of the teaching of young people, is the necessity of critical skills in a time of social media bubbles and partisan media.
Well, in terms of discourse, this has been pretty impressive. We have a ways to go. I'm an addict to news, and it's pretty depressing. CNN is all Russia all the time. At a moment when we're cutting the budget, we're getting rid of development aid, we're abandoning the climate treaty. We have big issues around religious freedom. I mean, it is, even if you go to several places, if all they're doing is focusing on one thing. In some ways, it's been a sobering discussion. I think it also ought to be hopeful for us in that we offer a different set of assets for Washington. We don't play the game that's been described here as a community of faith, as Catholic higher education. We don't decide what we believe based on the polls. We have a set of principles that are our life's work about human dignity, about human life, about solidarity, about the common good. We are anchored in communities. We have experience. Who shelters the homeless? I look at Father John here. Who feeds the hungry? Who educates the young? Who cares for the sick? Who welcomes the immigrants? We do this every day. And we have people, lots of people, including a lot of people who voted in ways many of the people in this room wouldn't feel very good about. But we have lots of other people, including some of those who are serving the poor every day, part of their parishes, and are trying to live their faith and their lives consistent with what they believe. And we have leaders. We have leaders like these on the stage. We have leaders like the people in the room who have committed their life to sharing these principles. And I think it is exceedingly hopeful that we have a leader like Pope Francis. E.J. Dionne couldn't be here tonight, and I have had this ongoing fight for decades on which is in more trouble, American politics or the Roman Catholic Church. And for a long time, he was kicking my butt. The church, we had scandal, we had this, we had that. So I said to him at one of our panels, I said, how does it feel, EJ, that the Roman Catholic Church is the source of hope and change these days, and Washington's the problem? It seems to me that Pope Francis does offer us an alternative vision, and I'll close with this quick story. 3 days after the Pope's speech, I had a chance with several other people to meet with a group of senators. And we talked about real specific things, sequesters and this and that. And I said at the end, how come you people don't talk about the poor at all? And they said, oh, we do. I said, there hasn't been a vote on the minimum wage in decades. Middle class, middle class, middle class, it's your mantra. And Tim Kaine, to his credit, I don't agree with everything Tim Kaine says or does, said, look, you're right, we don't. Frankly, we're advised not to. And he said, we probably ought to look at that. And I said, well, on a good day, your polls break 10. On a bad day, Pope Francis falls below 85. All he does is talk about the poor. Why don't you try it and see? It seems to me our message is what our country needs. And the other thing we ought to say is we honor these people for their discourse. The discourse in the church isn't always what it should be either. And we have to watch our tongues and respect the motives and commitments of others. But please join me in thanking these people for a great example of civil discourse.